So now we are going to turn to yet another expert panel. Bear is back as the panel moderator. And we're going to welcome Margaret Cook, Richard Fimble, and Dr. James Medea to talk about emerging issues in resilient energy and water infrastructure. That's right up JEA's alley, since we're the electric, water, and wastewater utility for Northeast Florida. Bear, I'm going to turn it over to you to further introduce Margaret, Richard, and James, and describe what we're going to learn for the next hour. Thank you.
Thank you, Laura. Yes, I am back. So as I started last session that I was hosting, why is this event important? And they're all important. They're all well put together. But again, considering the ever increasing frequency and severity of extreme weather and the impacts of climate change on critical infrastructure, emergency management professionals are increasingly confronted with the cascading impacts of energy disruption. And this is particularly true with the cascading impacts from energy to water infrastructure. But energy and water are highly specialized fields, and as emergency management professionals, we need to be constantly asking questions to learn more. And this is what we hope to tackle today by providing you with an overview of how both the energy grid and water infrastructure work. We hope to give you a snapshot of emerging issues within energy and water infrastructure, and then ways you can learn more about these two critical infrastructure sectors, and how best to engage with content and SMEs when you do things like your THYRAs. So with these objectives in mind, I'd like to introduce our panel and solve this entire energy water thing basically within the next 40 minutes or so. That's the plan. First, we have Dr. Margaret Cook, Senior Research Analyst with Houston Advanced Research Center. We have Richard Fimble, Director of Emergency Management with the South Florida Water Management District. And then Dr. James Medea, Infrastructure Security and Compliance Manager with Southern California Edison. And if you notice, we have representatives of different critical infrastructure sectors from either coast and then run right in the middle. So the way the panelists and I are going to interact, we're basically going to have one first round of questions for them. I will ask them a question, and then a second round of questions, and then we'll kind of leave room for some audience questions, and I obviously have prepared questions. So Dr. Medea, I will start with you and ask this question. What is the grid, and how does the grid work?
Well, I'm glad you used air quotes when you use that term, the grid. So I'm guilty of it too. We call it the grid, as if there's one giant grid for the United States. It's a little bit of a misnomer. There are actually several regional grids, and they encompass North America, not really the US. So it's US, parts of Canada, parts of Mexico. So let's think about the grid in two ways. First is sort of the geographic. So there are three major regions, or what we call wide area interconnections. That's the Western, Eastern, and Texas. There's also an interconnection in Quebec and also in Alaska, but we mostly talk about the three big ones. The Western interconnection includes Arizona, California, Colorado, Idaho, Nevada, Oregon, Utah, Washington, two provinces in Canada, which is British Columbia and Alberta, and then parts of other states like Montana and Nebraska. The Eastern interconnection pretty much picks up everything east of the Rockies. And then the Texas interconnection is a little bit of a misnomer because it doesn't even cover the entire state of Texas. Probably about 85% of it is the Texas interconnection, and the rest of it is a little bit of Eastern, a little bit of Western. So first thing you need to know about the grid is that the infrastructure of the grid, the circuitry of the grid, does not obey political jurisdictions, right? Which is why you pick up parts of states, counties, cities. We love to divide the world up into geographical, political jurisdictions. The grid doesn't obey those laws. We cross all kinds of boundaries. So all of that is regulated by the North American Reliability Corporation, what we call NERC. So let's talk about the grid functionally. So the grid can be divided up functionally really into three components, which is generation, transmission, and distribution. So the generation portfolio gets bigger and bigger all the time. Fossil fuels and nuclear was primarily our source of generation for a long time, but now we've got lots of renewables coming in and geothermal and some other things that are adding to the portfolio mix. Coal is more or less going away, and of the major fossil fuels, natural gas is the major source. Transmission is the big part in the middle. So that's the big steel towers with the large lines on them that you see when you're driving, usually on major highways. That's high voltage electricity that is designed to step up power to higher voltages to minimize the loss and the heat so it can move great distances, and then get that electricity to substations closer to where the customers are. The transmission grid doesn't serve customers, it serves the greater grid. Distribution is the portion or the component of the grid that serves individual customers, businesses, and homes. The voltages typically in the transmission area are somewhere between 100,000 volts and about 800,000 volts. And usually at the low end, your distribution circuits are anywhere from about 4,000 volts to about 16,000 volts. Transmission is undoubtedly the most important and most vulnerable part of it, because if you start disrupting transmission, you can actually disrupt the stability of the whole grid or the whole portion of the grid, say the Western interconnection, and you can get cascading outages that ripple into other areas from wherever the disruption starts. I think that's probably the best, like, short description of what it is and how it works.
Thank you for that. And the reason I put the grid in quotes is because of you and the research we did. So otherwise I would not have. What about microgrids? We hear about microgrids all the time. How does that fit in? What is it, and how does it fit into, the grids?
So microgrids is an emerging phenomenon where we take very small segments of the grid and use different types of computer technology to be able to share resources between providers and customers, between customers and providers, both directions, and between customers and customers. The vision of the microgrid world is that the grid will be more distributed and less centralized as a network. So therefore, it'll be a little bit more resilient. I think there's probably some argument both ways on that. But the other nice thing about the microgrids is that people can purchase and trade power based on what's best for their situation, to be able to save money and use energy in ways that's really focused on how and when they need it.
And one final question, as far as the grids are concerned, especially with transmission. A company like Southern California Edison, I know during our research and my prep with you, you mentioned that there are literally people who sit in your company and others like it that purchase energy. Can you explain how that works a little bit?
Yeah, so energy resources come on to the grid. Let's take the Western interconnection. They come on to the Western interconnection from solar farms, from wind farms, from large power plants. And what our procurement people do is they purchase power ahead of time. They schedule it ahead of time based on demand response. That's a projection of when is demand going to be high, when is it going to be low. A lot of that has to do with time of day, the time of year, anticipated weather patterns. And this is where we're starting to see some issues with different parts of the grid, like in California when we had the heat waves and we didn't have enough generation ordered up to meet demand response over the summer, and we ended up doing some rotating outages. Texas saw the same thing when they had not ordered up enough resources to deal with incoming winter weather, along with physical impacts to their infrastructure from the weather itself. So this planning piece is really important because as weather becomes more extreme and extreme weather events become more and more common, and that includes wildfires, it gets harder and harder to predict what tomorrow or next week's need for power is going to be.
Gotcha. I want to package basically what you said in those 5 minutes about the grid and basically make every young entry emergency management professional watch that. And you learn so much from that, so few minutes of time. Richard, I want to go to you next. I know you have a PowerPoint to answer this question if you want to start that up, but Richard, tell us how the water infrastructure works. And is there something like a water grid?
Hey, thanks. Appreciate you coming to me. Thank you very much. So yeah, let me go over sort of a quick overview of how water works, at least specifically down in Florida. The water areas down in Florida is basically broken up into 5 different water management districts down here. And that's sort of the overall picture. Now, I'm down in the South Florida Water Management District area. This map sort of shows that area that we cover. South Florida Water Management District is a regional government agency that manages the water resources in the southern half of the state. We cover about 16 counties from Orlando all the way down to the Florida Keys, which is basically about an area that has about 9 million residents throughout this entire area. Water management districts were created back in 1949, and this overall system has been working really good throughout the entire time. Now, it's pretty complex, pretty massive system. When you break it down to the little parts and how the water gets out to everyone, it makes it a little bit more understandable as you work through it. The Southwest, like I said, mentioned down here, we cover about the 16 counties and about 9 million residents. So part of that is to get the water from point A to point B. We have about 2,175 miles of canals, 2,130 miles of levees and berms that we manage on a regular basis, about 915 water control structures, 620 project culverts, and 89 pump stations. And now when I talk pump stations, I'm not talking like a pump that you'd go down to Home Depot or Lowe's to pick up, a 10-inch or 12-inch type pump. I'm talking about a pump that you can walk inside. It's about 10, 12-foot diameter, and pretty significant size. And it moves quite a bit of water throughout the system, throughout the entire area. Our water management, basically down here in South Florida, because we are relatively low and flat down here in South Florida. We're very low and flat. We have to manage basically the seasonal rain flow. And it can be a little bit of a challenge, especially with some of the recent weather patterns and things like that. You get some of these major rain events that bring in 10 or 12 inches at a time. And then you go into the dry season and you don't have hardly anything. So when you're dealing with a relatively flat part of the state and dealing with all that water through here, you do have to manage it. And that's part of what we do, is we sort of process it into different holding areas and putting it into specific areas. So when heavy rains are going on, you don't have massive flooding throughout the specific areas. But when we get into times of drought, or go through the dry season, especially when you get into February, March, and April, when things are really dry, you still won't have water to be able to continue to service citizens down here throughout South Florida. Now, the South Florida Water Management District role is we monitor weather conditions and water levels around the clock. We open our gates and we adjust the water systems to ensure that we're getting the right water in the right place at the right time. During heavy rains, we do have to push some water out. We push into different holding areas. And it's, the process works very well. A major part of what we do is flood control. It's basically a 3-tier system, basically almost like our highway system, where you have an interstate system, county and state roads, and then you have local roadways, which works out pretty good. You start with in your local community with the smaller roads, the smaller little retainage areas. You have the local community ponds and water areas and things like that. That feeds into the secondary canal systems. Those connect the farms and different neighborhood systems into the one major system, which is the major canal systems that move water into different storage and discharge areas. And if we need to, just all the way out and discharging out to either the Atlantic Ocean or the Gulf of Mexico. So there's a lot of moving parts into the system, which is pretty surprising when you step back and look at it, you think, oh, it's not that big a deal. And there is quite a bit going on in the background there to get things from point A to point B. So the South Florida Water Management District, well, we're actually putting water out to homes and businesses and things like that. That actually gets done through either the Florida 298 special water districts. And those are those little smaller areas that you can see on the map there that have just popped up. They're like smaller water management districts that are having a loud amount of water that comes into their area, that we will all work together to make sure that they don't have too much or too little at the end. But everyone does need to play within, their basic area. We also have water control systems in regions throughout the state. And as you see, a lot of these will overlie each other, the districts, water districts, and the 298 special districts, and these water control systems. So these are the smaller areas that are broken down even further to make sure that water is getting out. Your county, city water systems, your local water municipalities are part of these different systems that get water through the overall system. So it's a pretty massive managed system. We are dealing with a natural resource. It's not something that you have a bunch, necessarily you're not making it. It's something that you have to manage with whatever comes in. It is a natural resource. Yes, there are aquifers under the state. We use a lot of that for drinking water and things like that. But a lot of the main water for irrigation and things like that do come from rainwater that is processed through the entire water system throughout South Florida. There are multiple components to the system, and all of them do need to work together. I'm part of the emergency management portion. I lead up emergency management down here, so I do work with all the entities when there are major events occurring or potentially going to occur. Number one, obviously, for weather events and things like that, or other emerging potential threats and all that we will be discussing as we continue to move on. But that's sort of a general overview of the overall system. It is rather unique. There are so many different components. I could talk forever about it. But I just wanted to give you a quick idea of how a lot of water systems do work similar to how we have it down here in Florida, and how that water gets processed out. So that I will go ahead and turn it back over to you, Bear.
Great, thank you for that. A lot of times when we think about water infrastructure, we just think about drinking water and, the big actual physical infrastructure we sometimes pass that, clean water treatment plants. How extensive is the water reservoirs or lakes that you use? How extensively part of that system, the infrastructure, is that?
That's a pretty massive system, actually, that rotates through. We have massive reservoirs, and when I'm talking massive reservoirs, I'm talking like 6 miles by 9 miles in length. These big major canals I spoke of earlier. I mean, these canals, you might look at it and think, hey, that's not that deep, drive along roadways and things like that, which is what I thought before I was actually involved in this. I found that, come find out, a lot of them are anywhere between 12 and 20 feet deep. So just as canals along our roadway systems and things like that are very deep, there's a lot of water. When we're using pumps that have 10 and 12 foot diameter, you can just imagine the amount of water we're pushing through. And our pump stations have anywhere between 4 and 6 of those pumps per station. So it's just a massive amount of water. When you have 9 million residents and agriculture and everything else that we do down here, South Florida, it's pretty intense.
Great. Dr. Cook, tell us about how energy and water interact with one another, how they rely on each other.
Sure. So energy and water are very related. On the energy side, we use water to generate electricity in our thermoelectric power plants. We use water in the steam cycle, so producing the electricity itself, and then also in cooling that steam. We use a lot more water for that aspect. And so the steam cycle itself is recycling that water, cooling it. Some power plants do recycle that water, and some power plants discharge it back into the environment. So that's a lot of water in and of itself. And then we also use water to get the fuels. So for example, in oil and gas extraction and production, there's a lot of water involved in that. So dependent on water very much on that fossil fuel and thermoelectric side. Water can also affect the power sector. So we can have too much water, too little water, too cold water, too hot water. On the too much water side, our power plants and our transformers can get submerged. If you have power lines that are underground, like they are in the New York area, we saw that during Superstorm Sandy, where the lines were submerged, the transformers exploded. So definitely vulnerabilities on the flooding side. On the too little water side, we can have droughts that affect the ability for those thermoelectric power plants or our hydroelectric power plants that are dependent on water as well, to have enough water to be able to generate that electricity. And in Texas, we were vulnerable to that in the 2011 drought, where there was an exception made in the policy for how water is distributed in the state to be able to make sure that municipalities and power plants got that water. And it actually went to the state Supreme Court, and they're not allowed to do that anymore. And now there's a water manager for the river, the Brazos River, that dispute was on. So too much water, too little water. We can have too hot of water. So again, because water is used for cooling, it can be too hot for power plants. And because that discharge temperature is regulated, and in nuclear plants, that intake temperature is regulated, that can limit the amount of water that's able to be used for cooling at those power plants. And we saw that, and we've seen that in a few places, but in France, that type of regulation has affected power plants, and they've had to issue exceptions to discharge hotter water to the environment so that they can generate enough power to make sure that their residents are safe. Because at the same time that water is hot, the environment is hot, and you have residents that need to stay cool. And so there's a big demand for power at the same time. And we can have water that's too cold. It can freeze at the oil head. It can freeze at the power plant itself. And again, in Texas, we have a pretty stark example of that from the 2021 winter storm, where the freezing at different power plants and at our wellheads did affect the gas supply in our state, as well as the electricity supply in our state, causing cascading outages that caused cascading water outages. So that shows our vulnerability in the water system to our power system. We use energy on the water side to pump, heat, treat, chill, pressurize, distribute our water. So Richard mentioned multiple times the pumping that's involved in his area. That's a big energy demand. A lot of the operating costs for our water systems, our drainage systems, our water treatment, our wastewater treatment systems, a lot of it is pumping, especially if you're dependent on groundwater. That's a lot of pumping. If you're moving water across the state like California does, that's a lot of pumping. So we can also have big vulnerabilities in the water sector if there are vulnerabilities in the energy sector. So if we have power outages that can affect our water systems, and to go into a little bit more detail about what happened in Texas, cascading power outages became cascading water outages. Our water systems weren't able to pressurize their water. They weren't able to treat their water in some cases. So we had residents that did not have water service, or had water service where they had a boil water notice. And when you have a boil water notice, but you also don't have power in your home, you probably can't boil your water. So that becomes a human health concern already with the boil water. But if you can't access water at all, that's an even bigger concern. Yeah, so our energy issues become water issues. Our water issues become energy issues. They're very connected. We also can benefit from that connection between the two systems. We can take advantage of water solutions that can be energy solutions, and energy solutions that can be water solutions. And I can go into a little bit more detail about that if that's of interest. But for now, because we're planning for resilience and emergencies, we'll leave it at that. You are muted, Bear.
Sorry about that. Saying fantastic, and thank you for that. I was just taking some notes for follow-up, but Dr. Madia, I will go back to you, and I will tell the panelists, I know we talked about timing, but we're pretty good on time so far since we started a little bit early. And I know this next round is particularly important. So Dr. Madia, going back to you, what emerging threats and hazards do you see in energy?
Well, the way I look at threats for our sector is I sort of broadly categorize them into 5 basic categories, which is natural hazards, criminal activity and terrorism, cyber threats, supply chain and resilience threats, and then cross-cutting threats, which includes interdependencies, like what Dr. Cook was talking about. And let me just add one point about water too that doesn't come up a lot, and we don't think about it a lot, but it's there. Energy systems, like the grids we run, rely heavily on data and very sophisticated computer networks. And they do a variety of things. They run our circuit protection programs. They open and close circuit breakers. They run our basic computer network to help us run simulations. So we have massive data centers that run those networks. And those data centers consume a tremendous amount of water every day to keep their systems cool. So it's not just using water for steam to make power. It's also using water to cool technology resources for our data centers. And without that, we'd have a hard time functioning. So I wouldn't necessarily call that an emerging threat. More or less, the emerging threat is really how we're all interconnected. And you can add gas to that too, right? So the exact same sort of like loop that Dr. Cook was talking about with water, we have the same loop with natural gas, which is that we pressurize all those pipes to move natural gas around, but we also need natural gas to run our power plants. So we're mutually dependent upon each other. And if gas has a failure, it can impact us. And if we have a failure, it can impact them, and it can be reciprocal. So that's a big emerging threat, I think. And as systems become more and more complex, Richard's point was perfect, which is just the water system in his part of the country is incredibly complex and massive. So imagine in even larger geographic regions, as that complexity ramps up and each sector of the critical infrastructure world becomes more and more dependent on the other ones, interdependencies becomes an emerging threat. So I look at that as a big one. Supply chains. Supply chains is kind of the newest, hottest thing that people are really talking about, but this has been decades in the making, right? We have pushed the manufacture of critical components, transformers, and lots of other things that run the grid offshore. We don't make very much of this anymore. So supply chain interruptions because of international or political tensions or trade agreements or who knows what, or just the time to get the equipment here, because some of it's hard to move, creates all kinds of vulnerabilities for us. There's got to be a way to address how to incentivize domestic manufacture of critical components for all critical infrastructures, but particularly for the electric grid. I think it's a really important emerging threat that needs to be talked about more. And then obviously the climate change issue, and regardless of where you fall on your belief or non-belief in the climate change phenomenon, you can't deny the fact that extreme weather events are becoming more extreme. The scope and the intensity is affecting our systems more and more. And the frequency with which we're seeing wildfires, hurricanes, tropical storms, freezing winters in places in the country that don't usually get that cold. These kinds of things are throwing things out of balance, particularly in terms of demand response and being able to weatherize our equipment and protect it from the elements. So those are kind of the big ones. And then of course, physical attacks is a huge emerging issue. I do a lot of work with research on physical attacks of energy infrastructure. It goes all the way back to the 1970s. It's not a new phenomenon, but in this interconnected digital world we live in, it's very easy for a person or a group of people to see how something was done. People talk about the Metcalfe attack at PG&E, and now you can go on any of these dark websites or chat rooms of any of these extreme groups, and they all will refer to that attack specifically, with very detailed description of what was damaged at Metcalf and how it impacted the grid. Easy to copycat, right? So, and we're seeing definitely an increase in the number of physical attacks on electric infrastructure. And anecdotally, and if you study the numbers, you'll see it graphs out really, really obviously. And then probably the last one that I think people haven't quite got their minds around yet is, how are drones going to affect the safety of the grid? We have very little in place in this country to regulate where drones can fly and where they can't fly, and how we can interdict when they get into the airspace over our critical assets. And those drones can do a number of things. They can do surveillance, they can drop payloads, they can cause all kinds of grief for us, right? So I think that drones are another area of, in my opinion, emerging interest, with not a lot of rigor around national policy about how we're going to address it. But I think those are the big ones.
Very good. And of course, with UAS and counter UAS, we're hoping, just so everyone knows, we're hoping to plan a separate webinar just for critical infrastructure and counter UAS. I'm glad you brought up the physical attacks, because had we had this this session 6 or 7 months ago, I probably wouldn't have even brought that up. But that, and you mentioned it's been going on since the 70s, but it's just much easier to replicate and copycat. And I will come back to that in our next round. Richard, we'll go to you next. And I can bring up your PowerPoint if you would. What emerging threats and hazards do you see in water?
Gotcha. Yeah, I'll go ahead and I'll just skip the PowerPoint because I said a few items listed on there, because
Okay.
so many of the items were very similar, because I mean, the electric infrastructure and water infrastructure are both extremely similar. We deal with a lot of the same threats. We work in the same groups. I work very closely with my counterparts down here that are in the electric sector. And you know, the cybersecurity threats, obviously, both internal and external threats, mainly external, obviously, but you do have to deal with some of the internal threats and things you got to look at. So cybersecurity, I think, is one of the biggest things, you know, that one of the biggest areas we're looking at, because everyone's trying to come in at you at, you know, some way, somehow, in some form. And it's something that we're constantly trying to update and adjust and get things, you know, we're pretty far ahead, thankfully. We've got a very good group of people, but that's a huge area. Critical infrastructure security in general. I showed a quick map of everything that we have, and we are spread out over thousands of miles. You know, when you're talking 2,100 miles of levees, at 2,100 miles, of actually drivable levees that hold back a lot of water. We got high impact dams that we take care of. Part of our area is Lake Okeechobee. Now, of course, the Corps of Engineers takes care of that, but we're a partner with them on a lot of that for running the pump stations and things like that around the lake. So we work very closely with them on all that. But that all connects into the national levee system and everything like that. So structurally, you could be looking at any type of attacks. We see the attacks on the electric sector, on substations. We deal with the same potential type of issues. When you look at these pump stations, especially the coastal pump stations, when you're putting water either outbound or water's coming back this way, if you stop that, ramifications going back up the line, when I'm talking about thousands of different pumping structures back and forth up and down that entire line, things can get ugly really quick. And as I mentioned, Florida is extremely flat, especially down here in South Florida. So if you start backing things up in a wrong place at the wrong time, things will go bad really quickly. And it's something that we're constantly looking at. Extreme weather events, it was brought up. We are seeing that pretty big fluctuation of extreme weather events. We're looking at saltwater intrusion. That's a big issue right now, coming back into our systems. We're getting those higher tides, and they're getting higher than some of the experts originally predicted, very quickly, I might add. It was a separate session yesterday with Sunny, and she was talking about the weather the weather systems and the moon wobble and how that is affecting tides and how they expect that to even be more of an issue. So not only do I have to deal with high water, but I also deal with no water, with the droughts. You know, when you do have these extreme weather events, we do get these pretty significant droughts during the winter and early spring. You know, we have quite a few major wildfires that go across South Florida, through the Everglades and through just about everywhere else down here. It is a big issue that we're constantly dealing with and watching. As it gets too dry, if water's not getting pumped in, that does cause a pretty significant problem. Now, a lot of the Everglades restoration projects that have been going on will help mitigate some of those areas. But still, if we're going from an extreme weather event, you're dealing with tons of rain sometime and then nothing, and you can't keep that water trickling down through, you know, the river of grass, as they call it, down through the Everglades. You know, you cause a problem, start causing that drought. And we were very close to getting to that drought stage going into this winter, because we've been basically very low on rainfall the last couple of years. But then late season, we had two pretty good sized hurricanes. One dropped about 22 inches of rain in the northern part of our watershed area, and that has helped out and to alleviate some of the systems. So there's a lot of different things that we're constantly watching. You mentioned drones. We use drones for actually doing work. I use it for emergency management. I use it for damage assessment for after events. It's a great tool, but I'm very aware of the challenges. I work very closely with our different law enforcement teams down here, watching for what can happen. As it was previously mentioned, you know, dropping payloads in anywhere into a water system. I mean, an unprotected water system, essentially. I mean, Lake Okeechobee, you got all these canals and all. That's just out there in the public. It is a big challenge and something that we're going to constantly deal with as we continue to move forward. So I'll stop with that and answer questions as we go.
Great. And I can imagine, I mean, with infrastructure that large and diverse, the threats are numerous. I'll come back to one of the specific ones you mentioned in the next round. But Dr. Cook, going to you, I know you specifically study the energy, water, climate nexus. So considering those three together, what emerging threats and hazards do you see?
Sure. I think the biggest thing when you think about climate is that we have this water energy nexus. We know of the connections. Climate change exacerbates all of the issues that they have as they're connected to each other. So we have concerns about flood, drought, freeze, heat wave. As we see more of these events, some unpredictability associated with these events, they're harder to plan for in the future. We're using estimates from data from global models downscaled to local models to try to do those estimates, but that they're still estimates. We haven't seen these things before. So much of our planning in the past has been looking back at so in Texas, for example, we planned for a water future by looking at the drought of the 1950s. And we don't plan for a future with climate change as part of that drought state water plan. So as we plan looking forward, we're going to have to incorporate what climate change is going to do to our weather. For example, in the Houston area, we're expected to see longer, hotter summers, more days above 100, more nights above 80. That can be very difficult on our infrastructure when it doesn't cool down at night. We're going to see more drought, a little bit less rain overall, but more concentrated rain periods, so more likelihood of flooding. Those are the estimates of what we could likely see based on global models downscaled to our area. And there's things that we have to consider as we plan for these interconnections. More drought means more concern for our cooling in our power plants and cooling in our data centers. More potential for flooding is a giant concern, especially in the Houston area where we've seen so much flooding in the past, and it is very vulnerable. And then, as I mentioned, too hot water, again, bad for cooling, too cold, can freeze our infrastructure. So all of these concerns exacerbate that interconnection between water and energy. And then on top of that, as a society in order to respond to climate change and reduce the greenhouse gas that we emit, we're electrifying more. We are electrifying more of our heating in particular in Texas. The trend for how much energy we use in the winter is going up, and that's part of what stresses our grid when it does get so cold, that our demand for electricity is going up. And so that already isn't an impact of climate change on our system, but it's an impact of us trying to respond to climate change and impacting our system with that. And that can be more stress for the grid. It's going to mean that we're going to need more transmission, more generation sources. And again, because it's responding to climate change, low emissions generation storage, generation sources. Often those are distributed energy sources. So more transmission, more lines that can get to those distributed areas. And those distributed generation sources are often weather dependent, like solar and wind. So we have potential concerns that we're looking at in the future, not necessarily right now, although the grid is stressed, especially in Texas right now, quite frequently. But in the future, we'll have to consider those things as well. So we have the interdependencies on our systems. I also want to note that while the energy system has high-tech technology and computing, the water industry is generally behind that as a trend. Some systems might be better than others, but in Texas, for example, we have a lot of small water systems, especially in the Harris and Montgomery County area. That's one of the largest concentrations of small water systems in the country. And the small water systems may or may not have good technology. They're often less likely to be able to handle new regulations, contaminants of emerging concern, the ability to generate electricity when there's an outage. They're less likely to afford those backup power resources. So we have a lot more vulnerable systems in that case as well. And then finally, there are communication issues between entities. Richard mentioned that they communicate very well with their energy utility as a partner, but that is not always the case. Even if the energy and water utility are both municipal and both in the same city, managed by the same government, they might not communicate with each other. So we need to be better about communicating between energy and water sectors, but also obviously with the public, making sure they're informed of, for example, the boil water notices. I'm very scarred by the 2021 event, but communication issues are related to that. So the power issues causing water issues, and then the communication between both.
Very good. And Dr. Cook, I'll stay with you for the beginning of the next round. Any of the emerging issue threats that you identified, maybe the communications or the small water companies having less being less technology dependent. Can you give us a good example of a threat or an issue that either has been or is being addressed with mitigation efforts, or something that you think can be addressed with mitigation efforts?
Sure. One of the things that we do in Texas with small water systems is there is a group of subject matter experts that works with those small water systems to try to evaluate what their concerns are and connect them with resources. One of the problems that small water systems might run into is that they try to hire an engineer, but they don't necessarily, because they might be governed politically, but not necessarily by water experts. And so they hire an engineer that's not quite suited to their case. And so they might be taken advantage of. So this committee helps them to get somebody that's qualified to help them with their issues. And another thing that they can do is regionalize, so work together with entities that are nearby that have similar issues and try to get economies of scale with again, hiring experts that can help them, but also potentially with infrastructure. And so that's a solution or a way that small water utilities in Texas do respond to that. I would also go back to the climate change issue that I mentioned. So I mentioned that we use global models downscaled with data to try to do those estimates. That is one way that we try to work out planning for potential risks in the future related to climate change. And so we downscale and use climate indicators. So I mentioned nights above 80 degrees Fahrenheit, days above 100 degrees Fahrenheit, a longer heat wave, the length of the summer, the amount of days per year that we'll see more than 4 inches of rain. Those are the type of indicators that we use to try to estimate the local risks that need to be planned for in a certain area. And HARC has developed a resin application for the Upper Texas Gulf Coast that uses those indicators to help plan with our local communities.
Okay.
Yeah.
Let me go
I'll leave it there.
to, since we're coming down to the 5-minute mark, let me go to Richard. Richard, any quick, and I'm sorry, quick, of course, these are huge issues, but any quick emerging threats that you see with somewhat clear mitigation resolution?
Well, I think, Dr. Cook brought up a unique challenge, and all of these systems, doesn't matter if you're talking water, it doesn't matter if you're talking electric, they're all run by people. And if people don't sit in the same room and talk about things and talk about the issues, and know who is your neighbor, who are you working with, in my opinion, that's one of the bigger emerging threats. You do have to be proactive. You need to go out and find your neighbors. You need to find out who else is out there in your industry and those partner industries, because like it's been said over and over, all these things are interconnected. And if we're not talking, if we're not working together, it doesn't matter how much technology you have, things are going to go bad. You have to work together. You have to build those relationships. You have to get things planned ahead of time. The worst time they say to hand a business card is during a disaster. You want to do that way in advance. You want to know who's there. So when you pick up the phone because things are going bad with you, you know who's on the other end. And those bigger organizations, she mentioned Dr. Cook mentioned the smaller water companies and things like that might not have all the bells and whistles to detect or find issues or things like that. The bigger organizations that work, once again, if you're working together, you can be sharing, you can be talking, you can help bring up those people, you can try to educate some of the politicians. That can be a challenge of what's needed to get the right people in the right seats, so that they don't have these major issues when things go bad. So I'll leave it real quick and short there.
Thank you, Richard. Dr. Madia, finally to you. I guess, you listed a lot of threats and we're going to stay up all night thinking about all that stuff. But I guess focusing on the supply chain one, which is what we don't necessarily hear a lot about that as opposed to the others. There's actually a question in the chat as well from Rosemary. Does your industry currently use AI to try to come up with some solutions with the supply chain challenges, even for purchasing energy?
Yes, starting to now. Yeah, we're seeing more and more AI solutions coming in. I think we're at very early days of finding ways to make good use of AI to solve those kinds of complex problems.
Great. Okay. Any quick other solutions, mitigation strategies that you'd like to mention in 1 minute?
Yeah, really just integrating your emergency management program, assuming you have a good one at your company, integrating that with security, with risk, and also with the operational side that's doing a lot of the studies where system vulnerabilities and redundancy opportunities occur. Those need to be centralized conversations so that you're not operating in silos. Because the minute you start talking to one another, you solve problems much more quickly. And we've started doing much more of that in our company.
Great. Thank you so much. Panelists, you're my new best friends. And audience, while I know we didn't have enough time to obviously solve all the emerging energy water issues today, we hope that at least we were able to provide you with an awareness and also put you on the right path to ask the right questions, to engage with different stakeholders, and especially with other SMEs when you're performing your threat hazard identification and risk assessments. Thank you so much. I did put more info in the chat, some research that our panelists had done, and Richard's presentation is also in the chat. And Laura, I will pass it back to you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Oh, hey, thanks, Bear, and thank you. What a fantastic panel. It's very rare that we get to step back and look at so many different regions of the country and so many different disciplines. So thank you for really providing a wide-ranging and in-depth resilience conversation.